Welcome to the Relationship Recovery Podcast, hosted by Jessica Knight, a certified life coach who specializes in narcissistic and emotional abuse. This podcast is intended to help you identify manipulative and abusive behavior, set boundaries with yourself and others, and heal the relationship with yourself so you can learn to love in a healthy way.
Hello, and thank you so much for being here. Today I have Ginger Dean, a licensed psychotherapist and the founder of Loving Me After We. I connected with Ginger on Instagram after loving her content, which is all about healing after a toxic relationship. I think often we get really hung up on how we can love again if we are going to want a relationship again, and how to begin to heal after abuse. And I know a lot of us start to overthink, like, what did we do? How did we get in our own way? Did we sabotage the relationship? And I really enjoyed my conversation with Ginger. This is a really great episode, and she has a lot of content online, including My Heart Sabbatical, which is a mentorship program, the Inner Circle membership, and one-on-one coaching. You can find her on Instagram at Loving Me After We and at lovingmeafterwe.com. Hi, Ginger. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Ginger Dean. I am a licensed psychotherapist, and I specialize in helping women heal after toxic relationships so they can become the best version of themselves. So as such, I've seen clients over the course of my career who have been the child or the partners to narcissists, people struggling with codependency, attachment trauma, all with roots in unresolved childhood trauma. And so today, my main line of work is the Inner Circle membership, which is where we are a haven for women who are wanting to heal after toxic relationships, kind of unpack some of the things that brought them there so they can really start to do the inner work so they can, I feel most importantly, have a healthy relationship with themselves and then move on to be able to have healthy relationships with other people.
What got you into this line of work?
Oh gosh, it's a long, winding road.
I'm sure. Yeah. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, of course.
So I was initially a techie. I was supposed to be catching bad guys who use the internet for crimes. And I initially wanted to catch people who were engaging in like financial crimes online. And I eventually became more interested in why they do what they do and how they think, right? Like these are sociopaths amongst us. We can look up the case of, I think it's Vladimir and Citibank, and how he was literally stealing, I think it was like fractions of a cent from Citibank. And I thought that was so fascinating. I was like, my gosh, like, how do they even think to do this? And then, so I went into I wanted to try to get like a master's in criminology, but then that was more theory. Then jumped into a master's, which I did complete a master's in forensic psychology. And then I learned in order to practice, I needed a license. So then I went and completed a master's in counseling psychology. So what then happened after that is working with folks children in foster care. And so working in foster care with kids, you're exposed to attachment trauma, right? Yeah. Early on. And then that was really interesting because it helped me gain an understanding of red tape with the system, people needing the basics in order to live. And without that, that invites more trauma. And then eventually started working with adults. And I realized that adults have the same exact issues as kids do, because for people who are oriented with working with kids, we can tend to have a different perspective. Like, oh, kids are more moldable. It's easier to work with them. But then you realize like these adults are just adult versions of the children that you were working with. And they need the same care. They need the same understanding, validation, and compassion. And so while we learn a lot in grad school about, attachment stuff, and I can't even say they really taught us about codependency, to be honest.
Yeah.
Much of my work was after grad school in terms of that arena. And you just learn to pull it all together, because it was really surprising to me that the quote unquote working well had the same exact issues as my child clients did in foster care. They were just adult versions of them. And more interestingly, they were adult versions who had all the resources, but still had the same issues. So that's when I realized that regardless of your socioeconomic status in life, whether or not you had a great 2-parent household, or so you think, it didn't mean that you were going to escape relational trauma or attachment trauma, right? Yeah. And so I've had clients who are just like super rich, but they had the same issues as someone who had a mother who was on crack, abandoned them, years old. You know what I mean? So that's pretty much how I got here. Definitely didn't intend to, but I'm definitely fascinated by how trauma functions in the mind and how people think, and how, depending on the path that you take, how you show up in life.
I think that's so hopeful. And thank you for being so honest about your story. I just want to go to where you just ended with how trauma functions in the mind in our life. I'm in couples therapy. And one thing that my couples therapist said to us was that we need to be conscious of the fact that like we both have our trauma filters that we go through before we enter the world. So we have like our brain, and then we have this filter that we might be conscious of or unconscious of. It depends, or it's there. And then we're interacting with the world, and like a lot of the time we're in a trauma response.
Exactly. I love that.
We don't know it.
Because it's just how we've been conditioned to survive. And, I think one of the biggest things we can learn in healing is how to know when we're in survival mode, and how to know when we're looking at the lens through survival versus healing and thriving, because I think that will shape so much of the relationship that we have with others and even ourselves.
Yeah. Just to give some context before we kind of go into some of the questions I had for you. I'm curious if you can define, in your words, of course, what attachment trauma is. I feel like the people that listen to this podcast are likely going to think that they're going to think immediately about anxious, secure, avoidant. And I know that I have a feeling what you meant is much deeper than that.
I tend to look at attachment trauma. I think depending on the lens through which you're looking at it, right, it's going to be different, right? But when you think about it, it's really about the psychological distress that arises from disrupted relationships in childhood. That's like the formal thing. So like if a child is consistently neglected or abused, then a caregiver who's like, emotionally unavailable or unpredictable, that's going to shape whether or not you are secure, anxious, or avoidant. And of course, we have the different flavors, which is fearful, dismissive, or even disorganized attachment. And so when we have caregivers or parents who are just unpredictable, they're chaotic, they're inconsistent, you have this sense of insecurity and mistrust towards relationship. And so you might struggle with feeling safe. You might struggle with feeling connected to people. When you think about it with what I just said, anxious and avoidant people tend to struggle with those things, right? And so because you struggle with feeling safe and connected, right, your earliest experiences taught you that, hey, I don't know what it's like to expect you to be there for me. I don't know what it's like for you to validate me, for you to care about how I feel about something. So I might be anxious about it. Or because I don't think you care, I might withdraw from you when I feel like you don't really care, when I don't feel like I'm good enough, right? And so when your caregivers or your parents teach you that people aren't safe, you're not going to feel safe in your body. You're not going to feel that relationships are safe places to be. And so that can be overwhelming to a lot of people, because we do engage in what we call repetitive compulsion. You start to engage in a cycle of relationships that mirrored those early relationships. So that's when we start to act out or replay the attachment trauma in our adult relationships.
What does that look like if you can just give an example of the replaying, what that looks like, just to shine a light on it? Do you have an example that maybe very loaded, but it makes sense?
Yeah. So for example, let's just say someone who is anxiously attached. They might have had a parent who was emotionally neglectful, right? They may have had a parent who was just inconsistent, yet let's just say that that parent also raged. The only time they got attention from that parent was when they messed up in school. They didn't bring home a good, grades during midterms or something like that, right? They learn to fear that parent, but they also learn that that parent doesn't love them. They also learn that that parent could abandon them at any point. And when I say abandoned, I think people tend to think of like, oh, you were abandoned on the steps of a firehouse or something like that. It's literally like you get home at 3:00 in the evening from school. Your parent gets home at 6:00 and they don't really say anything to you.
Yeah.
You just put dinner on the table, if that. I've had parents tell me, well, I'm only going to give them a piece of bread and water and bring it upstairs to their room, and I want to see them for the rest of the day. And I'm like,
Yeah.
right. And so emotional neglect feels like abandonment. But a lot of people, in reflection, they don't really think of like, oh, that's just how it was, right? I mean, she came home, or he came home, we had food on the table, we did things on the weekends. But did you really feel supported? Did you really feel validated? Or did you feel emotionally abandoned? Who did you have to talk to when you had a bad day at school? A huge thing that comes up is, for example, bullying, and how it's not just about, for example, oh, the kids are bullying you in school. It's about the caregivers, your parents, your teachers, or principals who ignore your pleas for, please come save me, please help me, please protect me. And so that all translates into emotional neglect for a lot of people. And so guess what? Even from bullying, right? Even though it has little to really directly do with your caregivers, you grow up and you date people who bully you in relationships. They gaslight you. They invalidate how you feel. They might slap you around, for example. They psychologically abuse you. So that's how that can play out from childhood into adult relationships.
Yeah. And then, a lot of people that I work with end up in those relationships. They end up in these abusive relationships and then don't know how to get out of them, or are stuck in understanding what even got them there. And sometimes that actually prevents them from getting out of it too, because then they feel like, well, this must be me when I'm always here on the other side. Like, there definitely is probably a you aspect, but let's get you safe. And then you can work on that part, not at the same time of being in the abuse. And I think that it's so clear to me, being in this space, of like how those issues present in adult relationships. But I think a lot of times when somebody is in one of those kinds of relationships and they're seeing that, okay, I personally have stuff I need to work on. I think looking at the other person and saying, and they have equal amount of responsibility and stuff to do too, and are showing up in their trauma response, feels probably very alien to them in the moment.
Right, because we have a society that externalizes personal responsibility. We'll say, well, it's your fault for this, it's your fault for that. But if you look at how we're raised amidst relational trauma, it's always someone else's fault, because guess what? We punish our children when it is their fault, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, our brains are wired to avoid pain. So because our brains are wired to avoid pain, what happens is we grow up and we're in these relationships where, oh, they're the ones that have to change. They're the ones that are doing this, and you're doing that, and you're doing that, because we've been taught and groomed from a really young age that, hey, it's painful to take responsibility for my behavior, my actions. So I'm going to make sure that you take responsibility for it. Like, I forget where I was, but like I was watching like this child, like literally do everything that they could just to avoid their parent finding out that they did something. And the parent knew and the child knew, but they could not bring themselves because of the shame that would ensue with, oh, I did this. And then, mom piling on top of that, like, oh, and you're a bad kid and you're not going to get to go outside and I'm going to take the puppy away from you. And it's like, we don't teach our kids early enough that it's okay for us to take responsibility for certain things. Because then in our relationships, if I can say, you know what, I don't like the way that I talked to you the other night. Like, I could have handled that a lot, just much differently. I was going through a lot of stress, but it does not excuse the way that I talked to you. It was wrong. It was dead wrong. And I'm sorry. And I'm definitely going to do things differently moving forward. Right. Whereas, as a child, it's often like, if we take responsibility for this, then it means that we're going to be punished. Think about it. Every time a child, typically growing up in today's society, has to take responsibility for something, there's some level of shame there. And so what do adults in toxic relationships struggle with the most? Toxic shame. Self-compassion is the antidote to toxic shame, but toxic shame will fuel so much of our behaviors because we have so much shame in, for example, being alone, especially as women, adult women, right? So we get into these messy relationships, right? We have so much shame about our weight. So we either starve ourselves or we binge eat. There's so many things that toxic shame fuels. And I think it definitely starts in childhood.
Yeah. And I think that toxic shame, it's something that I know in my history has probably also kept me in some of these relationships, because I just became obsessed with, let me figure out and fix myself, rather than I can trust myself enough to know that this isn't okay. And I can still work on myself and choose to leave and have both exist.
Right.
Before we got into this, I was on your Instagram this weekend and you talked a little bit about dysfunctional behavior in relationships. Can you
Mhm.
define what dysfunctional behavior looks like?
So, in a nutshell, I look at dysfunctional behavior as behavior that doesn't allow for two people to connect in a healthy way.
Yeah.
So, for example, whatever it is, silent treatment, stonewalling, for example, that's dysfunctional. That's toxic because that's emotional, that's psychological, that's mental abuse, right? It doesn't allow for either of us to really connect with each other and really repair what's happening between us, right? So I look at it as anything that doesn't allow for us to. So, for example, playing video games is a big thing. Like my clients and members often date people that play a
Yeah.
lot of video games, or they have a third party, and it's not always like another person. It could be drugs, it could be porn, it could be video games, for example. And that person won't let go of that. Or it could be playing golf for 18 hours on a Saturday. And I live near a golf course and I see it all the time. And so that's dysfunctional behavior. And as much as people would say, well, playing golf, that's just innocent. Yeah, but there's avoidance there as well. Your kids are being neglected inside your marriage. So if the weekends are all you have to be home to spend time with your family, and every single weekend you're playing 12, 6, 12, 18 hours of golf, then
Yeah.
yeah, you know what I mean? That's dysfunctional behavior. But we often wait for dysfunction to result in something that's super
Yeah.
awful before we say, yeah, that's probably not healthy.
Yeah. That feels like one of those red flags that we can convince ourselves that aren't that bad. Right. Like I had a partner that was like, actually, this is what led me to this work because it ended up leading to a lot of emotional and verbal abuse. But it was like I was like, oh, he just likes to play video games every night. That's where it started.
Mhm.
Okay, he just plays video games. Not a bad thing. I could get like, you know, and then it turned into, oh wait, he doesn't make plans with me because he's playing video games.
Mhm.
Or if he takes a night, quote unquote, off from playing video games, now it's turning into I owe him time somehow. We don't
Mhm.
live together. And I'm like, this is a man in his 30s. And,
Right.
and
Right.
then we start going down this pattern of like, okay, well, maybe I'm just, and then this is when my trauma comes in. And I'm like, maybe I'm just like not flexible. Like, and then it's like, well, what is it really the biggest deal? It's just video games. And it's like all this shit that goes on in my mind before I was able to be like, okay, he's not prioritizing me. He's not prioritizing really himself because I see all these avoidant behaviors that also end up being my fault somehow. And like this one thing is actually so much more than he plays video games every night.
Right. And I remember a friend of mine, she's a psychologist, and she said, that's an addiction. And
Yeah. Yeah.
something that impedes you, one of the main relationships in your life, and you refuse to give it up. She's like, that's an addiction. And I was like, really? And she's like, yeah, really think about it. Like they're not, because we in psychology, like we define addiction as like one of the first things is, have you had any negative consequences as a result of this behavior in the last 12 months, right? And we often have people who are married where, again, for me out here, it's they play golf all the time. For some people, it's video games. Twitch is a big one, for example, and they refuse to let go of it. It's a way that they what do they call it? Like they numb, for example, when they're playing video games, they're just like disconnected from the rest of the world. Um, and they don't have any responsibility. And, that to me, that's indicative of like a lot of stress that's happening on the other end that they're trying to avoid. For whatever reason, they feel like it's stressful that they're avoiding it. It's
Right.
pain, whatever, they're avoiding it. And so she's like, yeah, that's an addiction because they refuse to let go of it. And she's like, think about it. Alcohol, they refuse to let go of it amidst negative consequences. Drugs, same thing. An affair, same thing,
Yeah.
right? They're addicted to that person. And that's often, we don't really talk about it in that way, but it's true. Like they're willing to torpedo their entire marriage, their relationship, their children, their money, their finances for this one person or this drug or this game or this thing. And so, yeah, that's how I tend to look at it.
Yeah. No, that was super helpful. And also, I think it allows us to listen to that and then take a step back and to see that a lot of these, we might be experiencing things in our relationships that we feel are maybe not that bad or not like a real red flag. But when we really sit with it and ask ourselves, like, what are the impacts that it's having?
Mm-hmm.
It ungaslights us in a way, and we're able to think clearer. That was super helpful. So I feel like this connects a little bit to our needs and knowing our own personal needs. And like, if I stay with this video game example, the way I justified it was, oh, well, I don't need a lot of time with my partner. I'm a single parent. I'm not someone that like needs tons of time, which was true. And I did work during the time, like I worked most nights. What was not true is that I definitely didn't need to be ignored. I didn't need to feel like I couldn't ask for anything or even talk to him.
Mhm.
But I started to really suppress my needs. And I see this with a lot of my clients is that they either don't know what they need or what they need. They sort of settle for the breadcrumbs of what they would want. And like that might look like, oh, well, at least he called me back, or like, well, we had a date on Friday. And I think I've noticed, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that it's so hard or can be so hard for people to think about what they actually want and what they actually need. How do
Right.
you think
And
about our needs?
I would say this, if you think about like your last 3 to 5 relationships, what were some of your most pressing issues in those relationships? So, for example, you can look at this through the lens of love languages too, but what were some of your more pressing issues? Was it abandonment? Right? Did you feel like they were always gone? They didn't really spend a lot of time with you. So your one of your core emotional needs might be quality time, for
Yeah.
example. Were you in a relationship where you were constantly like invalidated? That's going to be a core emotional need. I was telling someone else the other day, for example, I would not date someone who routinely did not give me one of my core emotional needs, simply because if I'm trying to heal, for example, from a parent who constantly invalidated me, there is no way I'm dating someone who constantly invalidates me too. That's going to impede my healing journey. And I don't believe in, while some people will say, yeah, but you learn to work through it. Actually, you don't. Like if you chopped off my hand, I'm not going to sit there next to this axe murderer who chopped off my hand and have them take aim at my other hand too.
Yeah.
Like you have to be someone who says, you know what? I understand your trauma and I understand that and I'm not saying they're going to explain it to you like this, right?
Yeah.
It's clinical. But if they can say, I know that you had a mom that invalidated you or that berated you, I'm not going to do that. I'm always not going to be perfect in how I say certain things, right? I'm constantly working on becoming, a better partner. But something I won't do is call you names. Something I won't do is invalidate your feelings. If I disagree with you on something, I'll tell you that I disagree, right? It's fine for you to have your feelings, but just know that this is my promise to you. And this is why I think it's so important for us to date people, one, that we trust, two, that we can have these conversations with, because we'll
Yeah.
date these people. It's an unconscious pull to get what we couldn't get from the mirrored parent from the past. So if my mother invalidated me and I go date someone who invalidates me, that's me trying to get validation that I didn't get or that I missed out on growing up. And so I think it's important for us to understand our core emotional needs do come from what we missed out on growing up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also think that I feel like I had like a bunch of my clients just flash before me as you were talking about that in relationship to at least their partners, because I work with people that are understanding and recognizing abuse and trying to break through from it, break through it. But often all those needs that a partner has, they're putting on the, the person that is recognizing it. So I would maybe like the healthy minded one. And then they can't break free of it because it's their needs, the way they said it, the way it needs to be heard. And it's exhausting. It's so exhausting
And
to
something
be
is like they don't want to tell the other person necessarily.
right. Or it's
What,
not safe to. It's not safe to have that conversation of like, I
right.
understand
Like
this
you're
is your
just supposed
trauma.
to know, why should I have to tell you? And it's like,
Yeah.
but you have to tell them. And then the other side of it, like you said, is like you have to make it safe for someone to say, I want to spend more time with you. I think one of the things that probably makes my teeth itch on the internet is to see like, well, this is how you explain to men. This is how women need to talk
Yeah.
to men about what they need. And it's like, why aren't we able to just say, I need more of your time? I want to spend
Yeah.
time with you. I miss you. Because then you say that and someone says, but it's going to make them jump back a little bit. So you just say it a little softer. And I'm like, why aren't we just teaching people how to be safe spaces for other people whenever they have to say that, hey, I need this, I need that from you.
Yeah. And I think that like the safe space, it needs to be built in some more of these like toxic and coercive relationships. There's this need of like, I hear the unhealthy partner, and I say healthy. I know when we're recovering from abuse, we don't feel very healthy, but I guess
Mhm.
the reason I use that language is more so because you're here and you're listening to this and
Mhm.
you're trying to get healthy. It's like, so maybe the conscious partner or the healthy partner is like, wait, like I need to build safety with you. I haven't felt safe in the relationship. Let's work on that. And the other person is, well, I can't be in it if you don't feel safe. And it just,
Yeah, and for
yeah.
me, I'm like, then we
Eh,
just can't be here because we're
right.
from two different places. And yeah, I mean, I do tend to take a hard stance on stuff like that because it's like we both need to be oriented towards emotional safety for this to work. And I believe in doing the work, but I think we
Right.
have to first be oriented towards the work. If I have to convince you to be a safe space for me, what am I doing with you in the first place is really where I'm at because
Yeah.
I'm doing your work and I'm doing my work as well. And so
Yeah.
I have to work to convince you to be a safe space for me. And then I have to figure out how to then be a safe space for you, which then builds a lot of resentment. So, yeah, some people say, yeah, but in the healing community, I think we have this addiction to the work that we
Yeah.
all want to find people to do the work with as opposed to find people who are already doing the work.
Right.
Like, I
Yeah.
get so many comments like, well, how do I convince them to go to therapy with me? How do I convince them? I'm not going to tell you how to convince someone.
Hmm.
Like, this work is so intense that you have to want to do it. Like, okay, you have to want to be a kind person for me to be around you, to interact with you. That's the barrier of entry. That's where we enter. That's where we start. That is the starting point. So it's not so much that you have to come ready made or perfect. I think it's important for us to understand that we do get to say, in order for me to be in a relationship with you, the starting point is you being a kind and safe person. Even if you're dealing with trauma, you have to be a kind and safe person because think about how many people you know who've regressed in their
Yeah.
own healing work because you're dealing with someone that they're trying to drag along to do the work. And I'm like, I've had to tell clients, you're doing their work for them. For example, I fired clients who didn't do homework, they don't really show up consistently. And I'll say, yeah, I'm trying to pull teeth in our sessions and I'm doing the work for you. And
Yeah.
I just don't know that you're in a place where you can do this right now. And, they'll come back a few weeks and like, you're right. I'm like, yeah, because I'm in this with you. This is a partnership. And if you're not doing homework, if you're inconsistent, you're canceling, that's a boundary issue for me. And number two, you have to be more committed. If I'm showing up and you're not showing up, if I'm giving homework and you're not doing it, I'm doing more work than you are.
Yeah.
So in our relationships, we both have to agree this is a safe space. But those are conversations, as you know, we don't really have. We just kind of jump in and hope for the best.
Yeah. Or work on our side of the street and hope that the other side does too.
Right.
And yeah. And like I'm very big on when someone's like, we just need to have safety together. I'm always like, did we build it? Are we building it? Like, I don't feel safe
Right.
right now. So if you're not willing to build it with me and it just needs to come out of thin air, then
Right.
I can't
And
do that.
And I think, also knowing who you're dealing with. Like, are you
Yeah.
dealing with someone who, by their actions, are showing you, I want safety? Like, and again, I guess because I've just seen so much from like, there's, quote unquote understanding, which is compassion on steroids for me. It's like
Yeah.
we can only go but so far. If you are consistently showing me that you're invalidating me and you're not creating safety, then what are we doing here? And I think that far more people are going to be compelled to heal when they realize that more healing people have boundaries around this kind of thing, where my emotional piece is so important to me that I want to date someone who is right here, who
Yeah.
understands that I don't want you to feel like I don't accept you for where you are. You may not be where I am in terms of healing, and I get that. So I don't want to date you and you feel like, well, I don't accept and like or love this version of you. I just know that this version of me would rather be with someone who is committed to creating safety. I don't want to have arguments all the time about, is this safe? Are you going to do this? Why are we doing that?
Right.
Those relationships where you're arguing more
Yeah.
about these issues than you are enjoying each other. I just think, yeah, we have
Yeah.
to be willing to, I think, just have more boundaries instead of trying to drag people along for the ride.
Yeah. You had an interesting post. I just remember seeing it and reading it, but I can't describe it well. and I know this isn't one of the questions we talked about, but it was on boundaries and coercion and that there's a difference. And I thought that was actually really important because a lot of us, I don't think understand that, especially if we're trying to, right? And so can you just touch on that? Because you just touched on boundaries. And I think it's a really, really important point.
So I think you're referring to, is it coercive control versus boundaries?
Yeah. And you had an example, I believe, about like somebody saying like, if you go to the strip club, like,
right.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, that was actually one of mine.
Oh, yeah.
If you go to the strip, I don't date people who go to the strip club. Me,
Right.
I don't date people.
Yeah. It's your boundary.
Like me.
Yeah.
I don't date those people. So that person was like, well, I mean, you can do whatever you want to do, but I don't date people who go to the strip club. That's not a threat. I don't do that. Now, coercive control is if you go to the strip club, you're going to be single when you get back here. That's a threat. I'm literally making a threat to get you to not go to the strip club. Or if you go to the strip club, the end of the relationship is going to happen. I'm simply saying right here at this outlet, I don't date people who go to the strip club. That's what I'm going to do, right? So if you're someone who goes to the strip club, then you have to consider whether or not this is the place that you want to be or that you can be, because I don't date people who go to the strip club. A lot of people struggled, I think, with that language, but with coercive control, there's always a threat. And I think that, how do I say this? I think this part is more so for folks who are healing. As I was reading comments on that post, I think a lot of us are so used to convincing other people out of their boundaries or challenging their boundaries because it was done to us that they had no problem saying, well, no, but why would you have a problem with going to the strip club? And I was like, well, my belief isn't up for grabs here. Like, that's not the issue here. The issue is I don't date people who go to the strip club. And that in and of itself was a problem for a lot of people. They were like, but trying to convince and trying to change it around. And I was just like, but what would be so bad about saying to someone, I don't know that I hold those same beliefs. I don't know that I agree with you, but I have to respect it. The same thing I had just told someone the other day. I don't haggle with other people about their prices. I can either afford it or I don't, but I don't want to disrespect you by requiring the same level of effort for something and then asking to pay you less for it. That's just a thing for me. So I'm not going to then say to you, I want you to go against your values here or your feelings about this and be okay with that because I want you to be okay with it. No, I'm just saying I don't date people who go to the strip and that's it. So in the commentary, I remember seeing so many people that it was just so evident that, you know how you have those arguments where you're not even negotiating boundaries, but you're arguing them down and they're in a control drama where both people are battling to be right. They care more about being right than they do about the health of the relationship and actually connecting with each other. Right. And sometimes it's not up for discussion. That's just not something I'm comfortable with. And I just want you to respect that. We don't need to have a long drawn out discussion where your goal is to convince me that how I feel doesn't work for you and therefore I need to change it. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Right. And I love what you said about there's more time on who's right rather than just allowing, being okay, we're both seeing this differently. How can we connect on where we are? And have build the safety in the relationship to pause on the parts where we're not and come back to it. And when we can.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I think that I've also seen a lot of people that question their boundaries because they don't know if it's okay to have it. And it is okay to have them.
Right.
People will have boundaries that you disagree with. It's fine. It's fine.
I agree. Right. And I think we just have to be like, does that work for me? And that's the scary part is if it doesn't, then the relationship has to kind of move away from each other. And that's the scary thing that no one really wants to talk about. And so I don't want to spend time trying to convince you to respect me. I don't want to feel like you're trying to talk me out of my feelings. Right. We just have to decide whether or not that works for us at the end of the day. Now, are there things that it's not about breaking up, of course. But I think in terms of the realm of coercive control, if you're threatening to the whole, what is it? Is it the Jonah Hill?
Yeah.
I think that came out of. And so using therapy speak to engage in coercive control was not on my bingo card this year, right? But the last couple of years, you've seen so much where people are using therapy speak in order to manipulate other people. And I think that was also a factor in me writing that post, which is you are trying to justify how you feel about something by saying, well, your therapist told you this or your therapist told you that, without a lot more context into like what you're actually telling the therapist. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so we just have to look at, I don't know, like some of these relationships are just so messy. And that's why like I don't really care to unpack so much of it. I just want to look at, are we spending more time arguing about the relationship than we are trying to connect in this relationship? There's doing the work. But I also think that when two people are committed to doing the work, they're going to be more conscious about the work that they're doing. So if my boss says, don't do X, Y, Z to your coworker anymore because they talk to me and they find it really disrespectful when you do X, Y, and Z, and I know that you like doing that, but please don't do that anymore. Do you think that person's going to continue doing that? They won't. It will be top of mind for them to not do certain things anymore. But in relationships, I think because when we endure trauma growing up, we're disrespected so often as children growing up. We don't know how to just respect someone else, the other adult in the relationship.
Yeah.
And so what happens is there is no baseline of, they don't like it when I do this. And as justified as I may feel about doing this, if I want to be with them, I can't do this anymore. Is it important for me to go to the strip club? Mm-hmm. Or is it important for me to respect that this is their boundary? I'm okay with not going to the strip club. So I'm going to, but to argue with the person, go to the strip club and then still expect to be in a relationship with them? No. So
yeah.
I think,
and to get them to like accept that they're wrong based on, despite their, the need being communicated and the boundary being communicated, is just shows the disrespect too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I know that we're short on time, so I want to end with this, but if somebody is thinking about a lot of, like, if they're sitting back and they're like, oh my God, so much of this is resonating with me, how can they begin to maybe start to see the relationship clearly, which I think is probably the first step if you're in it and you're like, oh wait, we are arguing more than we're connecting. Are there like a few things that you recommend to somebody if they're like, okay, I'm noticing these patterns, I need to clear with myself? What could they do?
Owning that this is where you are, right?
Yeah.
Like the self-awareness of the fact that every day that I sit here in this toxic situation, I'm choosing to be here. And I have to look at what allows me to be here. So with trauma bonding, it's always something familiar in your background. Because if disrespect was not a part, or if disrespect, disregard, all that stuff wasn't a part of your history, it doesn't occur to you that it would be normal to accept it. So first, I think being aware of the patterns in your relationship. 2, understanding, okay, so how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a lot of time, right? And then also then deciding like, okay, so what do I want to change? How am I going to change it? Will it involve some really difficult decisions? One of the things we talk about in the inner circle is decide, declare, and commit. So deciding that I want different. I don't want to do this anymore. This does not work anymore. And it often comes out of like this unconscious declaration of this can be what love is. Like it has to be different. There has to be more to love than this. Declaring to like your support system, your therapist, and saying, hey, you know what? Don't talk to me about my ex anymore. Saying to your therapist, for example, I'm done just being mired in this mud pit with this person and I'm ready to just change. And if you have a good enough therapist, they'll know how to shift gears with you, because sometimes you're just sitting there listening to you kind of like process everything. And then when you shift into, I want to actually heal, it's a different dynamic at that point. And then committing to the journey, committing, knowing that I'm going to heal and I'm also going to find out some really tough things about myself, right? I'm going to learn some things about the other person as well as to why they were with me. But then more importantly, understand that I'm going to have days where I feel like I am on top of the world. And I'm going to have days where I feel like I am ready to go back to my old life, because that has to be better than, the trauma of uprooting my Pandora's box, right?
Yeah.
So I think for me, those are the first 3 things. But in order to make the decision, I think there has to be an awareness and acceptance of the fact that this is a really messy place that I am right now. And the best question you can ask is, am I happy?
Yeah.
And relationships are not always going to be happy-go-lucky, and no, they're going to have up days, you're going to have down days. But generally, am I happy here? Am I safe here? And if you're like, yeah, I'm not happy because I can't remember the last time that we had a good day. And I'm always praying for us to have a good day. You're not, and being honest with yourself, because at that point, you're going to have to contend with the abandonment wound of, oh my God, but if they leave, I'm going to feel like they left me, or, like, what does that mean? But that's the thing. Are you happy? And then, that resistance that you have about leaving the relationship, if you're not happy, that's when you have to ask yourself then, am I emotionally available for a healthy relationship? Because if we contrast the boss that says, please don't do this anymore, right? I know that you like to do this, but don't do it anymore. Versus, okay. Versus like, oh yeah, I feel like I should be able to do it because I'm an adult. And well, are you open and available to being a respectful coworker? Right? What are you open for? And when we're healing, we may not be, but a lot of the times we don't realize that we're already not. Like we're not available really, because we would rather stay in this trauma bond and try to drag the other person as opposed to just saying, you know what? This just doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
I want to learn how to be available.
Yeah. How can people find out about the community that you run? How can they find more about you?
So I'm on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, primarily Instagram as Loving Me After We. And if you'd like to learn more about my community, it's lovingmeafterwe.com/join, or you can just click on a link at any point on my Instagram, and it'll take you there to the Inner Circle, which is my monthly membership for women who are working to heal after a toxic relationship.
Awesome. Is it also open to women that are beginning to leave a toxic relationship, or is it ideally for you've left and now you want to heal?
Oh, no. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is people think that you have to know. I won't pull teeth to force you to leave. That has to be a decision on your own. But we have women who are in messy relationships, and they're just almost like at this turning point where they're like looking at other women on the other side. So the relationship status does not matter. We have married women who are just literally there because they want to learn how to become better partners, but some of their own, messier dynamics are preventing them from being loving partner, for example. So your relationship status doesn't matter. And I think it's helpful for people from all walks of life to be able to see how they're managing their stuff.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll be sure to put the links to your course and to your social media in the show notes so people can easily find you.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.